Math 2, Advanced Factoring, which is factoring a trinomial where the a value is not 1 and we can't factor out a greatest common factor. See if you remember how to do factor by grouping before spring break by trying A and B. So on A, it's 4 terms. There's no GCF for all 4 terms, so we're going to try to do factor by grouping. So I'm going to group the first 2 terms, and then I'm going to group the second 2 terms. In that first set of parentheses, I see a GCF of A. So I'm going to divide an A out in the front, and then I'm going to divide to get my leftovers. Looking in the second set of parentheses, I can divide out a GCF of 3. So the 3 gets divided out in front, and then the leftovers are in the parentheses in the back. And then I was showing this step when we learned this before spring break. You're really taking that b plus 5 that's in parentheses in blue and treating that as a common factor that you're factoring out. So I'm going to divide by b plus 5. And that b plus 5 is going to come out in the front as the greatest common factor. And then the leftovers are the pink A and the pink 3. So then that's it. If you were to multiply this out, you would get what you started with. Now remember, before spring break, I mentioned this step right here. If you are getting really good at these and you don't want to show that step, feel free to drop that step. That's fine. For right now, I'll keep showing that step, but you guys can drop it if you're feeling more comfortable with it. Let's zoom in on this one. So we're supposed to be factoring. When I look at all 4 terms, I do not see a GCF for all 4 terms. So let's try factor by grouping. So group the first 2 terms in parentheses and then group the second 2 terms in parentheses. In that first set of parentheses, I have a GCF of AC. So when I divide both terms by AC, I'm left with B minus K. In the back set of parentheses, I have a GCF of 2. So I'm going to factor out the 2. And then the leftovers are B minus K. So both terms have that blue B minus K. So I'm going to factor that out in the front. It's the new GCF, B minus K. It's getting factored out in the front. And then AC plus 2 are my leftovers that I'm going to put in the back. All right, so that factor by grouping concept gets used in what most people call advanced factoring. So when we look at letter C, is there a greatest common factor other than 1? No. Is it a basic trinomial? No. And what I mean by basic trinomial is this value right here, the 2, that would need to be an invisible 1 if it would be a basic trinomial. And obviously it's not a difference of 2 perfect squares because it's 3 terms, not 2 terms. So that is the type of problem that we use advanced factoring on. It's this guy right here, when you have 3 terms and the a value, so again, this is the a value, is not 1. So here's the process we're going to do for these types of problems. You're going to find 2 numbers that multiply to whatever a times c is. And I just labeled everything on the left here. So a is 2, c is 6. So if I want to multiply to 2 times 6, I'm trying to multiply to 12. Then I want to add up to b. So I want to add up to 7. So very similar to when we were trying to find the numbers for basic trinomial factoring, very similar. So if I want to multiply to 12, let me try 1 and 12 first. That does not add up to 7. Let me try 2 and 6. That does not add up to 7. Let me try 3 and 4. Ooh, that does add up to 7. So now that I've found the numbers that work, this is where it's a little bit different from basic trinomial factoring. The 3 and the 4 are going to get used to split the middle term. Okay, so 7x is going to get split into 3x plus 4x, because 3x plus 4x is 7x. So that's where these 2 numbers got used, right there. the 2x squared in the front just drags down, and then the 6 in the back just drags down. That's the only new thing. Now you just do factor by grouping like we did in A and B in the warm-ups. So I'm going to group the first two terms, I'm going to group the second two terms, and then I literally just do factor by grouping like we did in the beginning for A and B. Now remember, if we're doing factor by grouping correctly, our leftovers should match. Like the leftovers in the parentheses, they should match. Sure enough, they do. So the 2x plus 3 matches. So I'm going to divide that out in the front. And then the leftovers are the pink x and the pink 2. X plus 2. Ta-da! So there you go. That's it. So the only new thing with this advanced factoring is the beginning part. So this little T-chart with the A, C, and the B, that's the only new part. Let's try D. So on D, the first thing we want to check whenever we're factoring, no matter what type of factoring, if there's a greatest common factor, take that out first. So on D, there is no greatest common factor other than the number 1. Next thing we should check, is it 3 terms? Is it 2 terms? Is it 4 terms? So it is 3 terms. So it's a trinomial, not a difference of 2 perfect squares. It's not 2 terms. Now that I know it's a trinomial, look at my A value. My A value is not 1. If it was 1, I would just do that basic trinomial factoring that you learned last week. But since the A value is not 1, let's do this new advanced factoring process. So I'm looking for 2 numbers that multiply to whatever the A value times the C value is. And then those same 2 numbers, I want them to add up to whatever the B value is. So A is 3, C is negative 2. 3 times negative 2 is negative 6. And then the B value is negative 1. Because remember, there's an invisible 1 there. So then just brainstorming what multiplies to negative 6 and adds to negative 1. And remember, if you're somebody who's good with your number sense and you can just think of those 2 numbers really quickly, go ahead and just jot them down and use them right away. I keep showing my work to pretend like I'm someone who's not super great with my number sense so that you can see how I logically test numbers to get to the 2 numbers that actually work. So let me just start with 1. 6 divided by 1 is 6. Since I'm multiplying to a negative 6, one of those numbers has to be negative. Since I'm supposed to add up to a negative 1, I'm going to make my bigger number negative. So 1 plus negative 6 is negative 5. That does not work. Let me try 2. 6 divided by 2 is 3. Make the bigger number negative. 2 plus negative 3 is negative 1. So yes, that works. So now that I've found the numbers that work, I'm going to split that middle term into 2x. And if that second number is negative, I personally like to do plus negative 3x, just to make it easier in the next step when I add in my parentheses. So I like to do a plus minus. You may be wondering, does it matter if I put 2x first or does it matter if I put negative 3x first? It does not matter. The steps will be a little bit different in the middle, but you'll get an equivalent answer at the end. So drag down your 3x squared in the front. Drag down your minus 2 in the back. And then again, this just turns into factor by grouping like we did in A and B. So group your first 2 terms, group your second 2 terms. In the first set of parentheses, I'm going to factor out a greatest common factor of x. In the back set of parentheses, notice the first term is negative. So that's why we were training ourselves before spring break to always factor out the negative version of the GCF. And there really isn't much of a GCF there other than let's just take out a negative 1. That way our leftovers match. So then that 3x plus 2 matches as a GCF. We can pull that out in the front. In the step I just did, the division by 3x plus 2 in green, if you want to start skipping that step, feel free to skip that step and just jump to this answer here at the end. And there you go. Why don't you pause the video and try E? So on E, is there a GCF other than 1? No. It has 3 terms, and the first term has an A value that is not 1. So this is a perfect candidate for this new advanced factoring that we've been doing today. So we want to find 2 numbers that multiply to whatever A times C is. So A is 5, C is 6. 5 times 6 is 30. And then we also want to have those 2 numbers add up to the B value. So the B value is negative 17. So 1 and 30, but they both have to be negative because that's the only way I can add up to a negative number and multiply to a positive number is if both numbers are negative. So that doesn't work. Let me try 2. So 30 divided by 2 is 15. Make them both negative. There we go. So negative 2 and negative 15 are going to be used over here to split the middle x term. Drag down the 5x squared in the front, drag down the 6 in the back, and then do your factor by grouping. So group the first 2 terms, group the second 2 terms. I'm going to pull out a greatest common factor of x in the front. And then I'm going to pull out a greatest common factor of, let's see here, negative 3 in the back. And again, I want to pull out a negative version of the GCF because that way our leftovers in the back will actually match. If I had divided out a positive 3, the leftovers in the back would almost match, but all the signs would be opposite of what we would need them to be. So then 5x minus 2 matches. I'm going to factor that out in the front, and then my leftovers are in green in the back, x minus 3. So again, this is called advanced factoring. We use it to factor a trinomial that has an A value other than 1. And technically this method could be used even for a trinomial that does have an A value of 1. It's just kind of unnecessarily long when we could do that basic trinomial factoring so quickly with the method we learned last week. I would try those 4 practice problems at the bottom and then check them at the end. So now that you've done a couple of these, I think I'm going to start dropping that one step that I told you could drop. And just to save time, if you look at 1, 2, 3, and 4 all together real quick, none of these have a GCF other than 1. All of them are trinomials where the A value is not 1. So all of these are candidates for advanced factoring, the lesson, the new topic for today. That'll speed things up rather than have to talk about that on every single question. So on 1, we have A, B, and C. So A times C is 5 times 4, which is 20. So we want to find 2 numbers that multiply to 20 and add up to our B value, which is 21. So I think we're lucky on this one. It's the very first one we try. 1 times 20 is 20. 1 plus 20 is 21. So that works right off the bat. So we're going to split 21x into 1x and 20x. We're going to drag down the 5x squared in the front. We're going to drag down the plus 4 in the back, and then we'll do factor by grouping. So in that first set of parentheses, my GCF is x. So I'm going to divide out an x. In my back set of parentheses, the GCF is 4. So I'm going to divide out a 4. And then my leftovers match. And then you could show the step where you divide by 5x plus 1. I'm going to speed things up a little bit and just pull the 5x plus 1 out in the front. And then I have my blue leftovers in the back like that. If you need to keep showing that extra step, go for it. On 2, we want to multiply to AC and add to B. So here's A, B, and C. So 5 times negative 3 is negative 15. and then b is positive 14. So if I'm multiplying to a negative number, one of my numbers has to be negative, one has to be positive. If I'm trying to add up to a positive 14, I want my smaller number to be negative and my bigger number to be positive. So lucky ducks, that's our first shot. Works. Those numbers work right off the bat. So we're going to split the 14x into negative 1x and 15x. We're going to drag down the 5x squared in the front and the negative 3 in the back. Add in your parentheses. In the first set, we're dividing out a GCF of x, and then our leftovers are 5x minus 1. In the back set of parentheses, we have a GCF of 3. So we're going to pull out a 3, and then our leftovers in the parentheses are 5x minus 1. So the 5x minus 1 gets factored out in the front, and the leftovers are the purple x plus 3. On number 3, we want to multiply to AC, add up to B. A is 3, C is negative 6, so 3 times negative 6 is negative 18, and B is negative 7. So 18 divided by 1 is 18. I'm trying to add up to a negative number, so I want my bigger number to be negative. So that first set of numbers does not work. Let's try 2. 18 divided by 2 is 9. Make my bigger number negative. 2 plus negative 9 is negative 7. So yes, that works. So we're going to split negative 7x into 2x plus negative 9x. Drag down the 3x squared in the front. Drag down the minus 6 in the back. Group the first two terms in parentheses. Group the second two terms in parentheses. And then let's divide out a GCF of x in the front. And then in the back, since the negative 9, since it's negative, take out a negative 3 for your GCF instead of a positive 3. That way the leftovers should have the correct signs. And then the 3x plus 2's match, so divide that out in the front as a GCF, and then the x minus 3 are the leftovers in the back. Last one, on 4, AC would be 3 times 10, which is 30, and then B is 17. And again, if you know the two numbers that multiply to 30 and add to 17, don't waste your time doing all this stuff that I'm showing off to the side. I'm just showing this work over here in case someone's not great with their number sense. So 30 divided by 2 is 15. 2 plus 15 is 17. There we go. We found the two numbers that work. So we're going to split that 17x into 2x plus 15x. We're going to drag down the 3x squared in the front, and then drag down the plus 10 in the back. Group the first two terms in parentheses. Group the second two terms in parentheses. Divide by a GCF of x in the front. Divide by a GCF of 5 in the back. And that should be good. And then you have 3x plus 2 that gets pulled out in the front. And then x plus 5 as your leftovers in the back. Just a little hint, with the back set of parentheses, or really any of the parentheses, if you ever don't have a GCF, I would go ahead and divide out a 1 just kind of as a placeholder, just because it makes it easier in future steps to have the placeholder there.